Thanks for coming, everybody. We're really excited to welcome Professor Joe Marino, although I'm sure he'd rather you just call him Joe, to talk to us today. He teaches at the University of Washington in Buddhist studies and Sanskrit, Buddhist texts. Joe was actually a fellow student of mine, kind of not at the same time of my teacher at the UW, his teacher, Professor Kyoko Tokono, who passed away a few years ago. So we have a connection in that way. And then Joe was also my Sanskrit teacher. And so he's a wonderful speaker. We're really excited to hear what he has to say about the importance of Sanskrit in understanding Buddhism. And I'm going to sort of let him do the rest of the introduction. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Oh, loud. I'll try not to project too loud. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm a little under the weather, but hopefully this is easier for you to hear and follow along. Okay, I got that sign. Okay. I think that's plenty introduction. I feel very much like I'm a guest. It might not be obvious to you, but I don't come from a Sanskrit-using family or background. I came to this through my interest in Buddhism, academically. Almost everything I know about early Buddhism, Buddhist practice, comes through the academic study of Buddhism. So I really like to come talk to communities like yours, where Buddhism is not some academic thing. It's what we do. You know, it's life on the ground. And so I really appreciate, Leonore, the opportunity to bring what happens at the university to Seattle Betsuin, learn from you, hear your questions. Please stop me at any time as I go. I have a habit of talking too much and too long. I will promise to stop as soon as Leonore tells me to. We'll talk a little bit about the languages around the time of the Buddha, the languages in India when Buddhism's first being developed, what languages were important for the history of Buddhism in India, and how did they influence, for instance, the early Buddhist texts that get translated in China? So these Chinese translations, which are so important to Mahayana today, all around the world, what were they translating from? What were those languages? And I thought we would start by speaking a little bit of Sanskrit. So please repeat after me. Suprabhatam. Suprabhatam. Theoretically, all Sanskrit words come from little roots, these hypothetical root words. They're not really words that you'd see in a sentence, but it's how you'd look up a word in a dictionary. And from those little roots, you can make all kinds of new words. And so all these important Buddhist words that we say every day often are enriched. Our understanding of them can be enriched if we have a sense of the little root words that they come from. So let's do a few examples to get a sense of this idea. This word suprabhatam means good morning, and it comes theoretically from this little root sound. You can repeat after me, pa, bha. It means to shine or be luminous. And if you put a little prefix before it, prabha, pra means that way, out. So shine forth. Su, before all of this, means good, well. So suprabha means to shine really well. Amitabha, Amida Butsu, Amida in Sanskrit is Amitabha, at least one interpretation. That little bit at the end, bha, comes from the same root, to shine. So he is Amita, unlimited shining, unlimited light in one translation. When you put this little ta sound at the end, it means something that has happened in the past. So suprabhata means nicely, forward, shown in the past. So if I want to say to you, hey, good morning, and I say suprabhata, what is it that has shown nicely that we're all acknowledging in the morning? The sun. That's right. We're just saying, it's bright out, isn't it? Right? So suprabhatam. And words like this come from these little theoretical roots like bha. Let's look at another one. Repeat after me. Sanskritam. Sanskritam. This is probably a more accurate way of pronouncing the word that we usually say Sanskrit. which sounds to a lot of people like writing in the sand script, right? So in American English, we typically say Sanskrit, which is this ancient Indian language so important to early Buddhism. It's pronounced Sanskritam. It comes from this little root. You can repeat after me, kri. Kri. Kri means to do or to make. Samkri means to make together, to make fully. Add ta again, samskrita. S just sort of sneaks in there, don't worry. Samskrita means something that was done or made nicely, fully, well. And so the Sanskrit language is this pretty language, refined language, language that has been made properly with nice grammar according to nice rules. Does anybody know what the nice language of ancient India would be in contrast to some of the less nice languages, the less well put together languages? Does anybody know any other ancient Indian language important to Buddhism? Pali, that's right, Pali. That's actually a pretty nice language too, very well put together. But this is in contrast to all the spoken languages that are more casual and more flexible. So Sanskrit is really rule-bound and uniform and beautiful. Let's look at some Buddhist words with the same kind of analysis. So the word Buddha, what does Buddha mean? Anybody know its basic meaning? Awakened. Perfect. Awakened. Comes from this little root. Bud. Bud. Repeat after me. Bud. Bud means to get up, to wake up. It can literally mean in the morning, you just wake up, or it can mean you're conscious, you're aware. The little dha at the end, the extra dha at the end, is just like the ta we put at the end of the previous words. It means something that woke up in the past. So the Buddha literally is just somebody that woke up. You can be Buddha every morning in a very casual way when you wake up from sleeping, but of course it has a metaphorical sense here. You can make all kinds of other words from the same little root. So if I say sa buddhyate, it means she wakes up. A noun we can form from this little root bud by making a couple small changes to it is this noun bodhi. How many of you have ever heard the word bodhi? Is there a word that you know that it's part of? Bodhisattva, yeah. So this word bodhi is connected to the idea of waking up. So the intellect, wisdom, or awakening is built just from the same little root that the word Buddha comes from. What about dharma? What does dharma mean to you in a one-word definition? Teaching. Yeah. For Buddhists, it typically means teachings. It's such a complicated word in Sanskrit and in the history of Indian religion. It also comes from a little root. You can repeat after me, dhri. Dhri means to hold or carry or preserve. Old words built from this, ancient words, far older than the Buddha's life, include the word dharman, which means support or bearer. So you can see how to hold can make a noun that means support. Later notions of dharma start to mean something like custom, virtue maybe, or duty. So for instance, in the Hindu world, the early Hindu world, before the Buddha lived, dharma meant something like what you should do according to your social class and the expectations of you based on your role in society. So if you are a fighter, your dharma is to fight. If you are a sweeper, your dharma is to sweep. But this develops a specific kind of religious feeling, both in Hinduism and in Buddhism, and it comes to mean something like what you should do based on the nature of things, just the nature of reality. If you can perceive it clearly, it might tell you how to behave in the world. Well, the Buddha perceived reality in a certain way, right? And what he taught about behavior in relation to the reality that he sees is just this dharma. So when we know the word dharma as teaching, it's really pointing to this underlying sense of like the underlying nature of reality that the Buddha learned and then taught. And we see it in his teachings. If any of you ever heard the word dharani? Maybe that's not used in Japanese. I don't know. Okay. We'll skip it. Don't worry. Another word we all know, sangha, I think. What does this word typically mean? Community. Yeah, the Buddhist community. This too comes from a little root. And that little root, interestingly, I just learned this. The root underlying this word is hun. Do you know that root? Do you remember it? It means to kill and or strike in in classical Hinduism, but at its core it means to meet or encounter or to join. And do you remember that sam in Sanskrit? To make together, made together. Sam plus han changes the pronunciation a little, but it means to meet together, to come together. So in its very basic sense, the Sangha is a coming together. It's really literally a community. So many of these key important Buddhist words, I would say that the full richness of making sense of them, it becomes evident when we start to see the underlying Sanskrit, the underlying origins of them in Sanskrit. So big question, where does Sanskrit come from? I think we all know, but what country do we associate ancient Sanskrit with? India. Yeah, India. Anybody know about when this language first started to be used? Dates are hard. Guess, throw out a date. Well, that's exactly right. What was your name? Mark says 3,500 years, and that's exactly what I have on my slide. About 1500 BCE, it started to be used. And not a lot of people know this, but Sanskrit is connected to English and German and Greek and Latin and Persian and lots of other languages. They all come from a similar language family called the Indo-European language family, and a sub-branch that represents the languages of Iran and India is called Indo-Aryan. And we'll get to these indigenous languages kind of briefly. But it was early on the language of religious ritual for what we would call Vedic communities. We're not talking about Hinduism as it is today, but the early influences of modern Hinduism. And it was restricted. Its use was only appropriate for ritual process. People chanted Sanskrit as they performed rituals to certain gods. Many gods whose names are still in, for instance, use in Buddhist communities in Japanese. So the old Vedic gods have in many ways gotten converted into East Asian supporters of the Buddha and Buddhist tradition. It's too much for today, but worth mentioning. And for about 1,500 years, Sanskrit was restricted. Only the Brahmins, this priestly class who performed these religious rituals, were able to transmit literature in this language. But around about 2,000 years ago, for various reasons, that spell broke. And all kinds of people, especially in North India, started using Sanskrit, including Buddhists. So we'll keep that in the back of our minds. So I heard Pali. Who said Pali as another early language? Yeah. What was your name, sir? Oh, okay. That's okay. Several people said it. Okay. Or I misperceived reality. So what Buddhist tradition holds Pali as the most important language for transmitting Buddhist materials? Does anybody know? Theravada, yeah. Where do Theravada Buddhists practice? Do you have a sense of that? I played a lot of metal music in my life, and I don't hear so well anymore. I think I heard Southeast Asia. So yes, Sri Lanka, Thailand, other parts of Southeast Asia, Seattle. We have plenty of Pali language transmitters and Theravada communities here as well. So early Sanskrit, that language I just talked about from 3,500 years ago, it's the parent language for many of the languages that were also used around the time of the Buddha. Pali is one of them. The language that I specialize in at UW is called Gandhari, which was used in what's today Pakistan, Afghanistan. We don't really think of those places as Buddhist countries, but they were indeed very important to Buddhism in the early days, especially in transmitting Buddhism to China and East Asia. And there were other languages that were used and became the special languages for other religions like Jainism, which is also practiced in Seattle today, another Indian religion that emerged right around the time of the Buddha. So there's a group of languages that aren't quite Sanskrit, but seem to be derived from Sanskrit. And all of these, including Sanskrit, were being used for different reasons during the life of the Buddha. Many modern languages in India, Bangla, Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi, you may all have friends from India who speak one of these languages. They are all in some way, shape, or form, these ones in particular, derived from Sanskrit through the mediation of these other languages. So Sanskrit's not just important for Buddhist history, but for understanding modern languages of South Asia. This is probably too much, and I'll go quickly through this bit, but one thing people mistake is they often think Sanskrit was the only special classical language of India. It's what all the important early, especially religious literature was written in India. But the truth is, there are many other language families in India that were important for Buddhism, important for the history of India, especially this family called Dravidian, which today is important in South India. And there are political movements, especially in India, that really like to frame all of Indian history through Sanskrit, but it's richly diverse. The history of India is not one language's history. And so it's important for us when we talk about Sanskrit, especially, in the history of Buddhism, we like to treat it as a kind of magical language, this special language that was the ancient cultural heritage of India. But it's just one part of India's history. Okay. So for Buddhism, to summarize, languages derived from Sanskrit like Pali, Gandhari, and many others that we've lost now played the biggest role. Buddhist texts were transmitted in India in the early period by word of mouth first, not by writing. Oral transmission, teacher, student, face-to-face experience like that. When we finally see written Buddhist texts, they're not in Sanskrit. The earliest ones we have evidence for were in a language called Gandhari from Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is probably an accident of history. If you know anything about Afghanistan and Pakistan, you might think they're dry, drier than India, where the monsoon plays a big role. All that rain has made it so the history of Buddhist texts gets lost, falls apart. Materials don't survive long in that kind of climate. So probably Buddhism was transmitted in many languages in those early days, but it just so happens it's a language called Gandhari that we have our first evidence. Question? Oh, I thought you had a question. Of course, there's another way we can learn about early Buddhism. It's Chinese. And Chinese Buddhist texts started to be translated really, really early in the history of Buddhism. It's shocking how fast monks made it to China, and Chinese speakers and writers found a way to translate Buddhism into Chinese, and then, of course, later into other East Asian languages. Early Buddhism is not just Indian heritage, it's very much Chinese heritage and East Asian heritage. And those Chinese translations often give us hints. We can look at them and see what the underlying Indian language they were translated from might have been. It's hard, but there are clues. And so sometimes we can say, oh, this was not Sanskrit. This was Gandhari. Or this was not Pali. This was some language we don't know yet, but it was none of the above. And sometimes they had a lot of trouble translating. And we can see this interesting, rich, multilingual history of Buddhism in India through these troublesome translations. For instance, does anybody know this word Avalokiteshvara? Who's Avalokiteshvara in Nihongo de? Kannon, yeah. And Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit, that last bit, Ishvara, it means Lord or God. And Avalokita means something like looked down. But loka also looks like the word for world. And sometimes the word is not Ishvara, but it ends in swara. And swara means sound. And so you can find these early Chinese translations of Kannon's name. Any kanji readers, I'm sure, in here, that first one, looks himself at what is placed, at what exists. What's the second one say? Anybody know? Yeah, sound is the second word. Looks at the sound. Looks at the sound. And so you could tell two different translators were saying, I don't quite know what this person's name means, right? And it's because the underlying Indian language, Sanskrit, Pali, Gandhari, there were just slight enough differences between one and the other that as Buddhist texts were transmitted, these little curious changes get adopted into Chinese. And they persist today. I won't dwell on this if nobody knows it, but has anyone ever heard this word, solitary Buddha? Or the Sanskrit word is pratyeka Buddha. Sometimes you see in Buddhist texts a translation, a certain character shows up who's a solitary Buddha. But sometimes in Chinese, does anybody know what the bottom two characters translate? It says something like causes awakening. Awakening because of a cause. And this too is the confusing process of translating an Indian language into Chinese. I won't dwell on this, but just to tell you, really important, key, central Buddhist characters, Buddhist ideas have often been very challenging to translate from one language to another. Ultimately, even though languages like Pali and Gandhari and many that we've lost just didn't survive over time, even though those were the most important during the early period of Buddhism, Sanskrit eventually won. Something about that old ritual language that the Vedic priests used, maybe it was because grammarians had fixed it so nicely and it had good rules, and you could learn Sanskrit in the north, in the south, and you all had a really clear idea of what was being said. Maybe it was that, maybe the prestige of those priests and the ritual language was so strong that more people started to adopt it. But whatever happened, Buddhists started to adopt Sanskrit. Instead of just these other languages, they said, we're going to use Sanskrit too. And so any Buddhist texts from about the 3rd or 4th century that got transmitted out of India could have been in Sanskrit. And for the most part, that was the preferred way. And Buddhism flourished in India for 1,000 years after that. So imagine every time a monk or a nun traveled from India to China or further, they were bringing with them in their minds or on the page something written in Sanskrit. And then in East Asia, those were translated. And so Buddhism in Central Asia, East Asia, Tibet, Southeast Asia, any new developments in Buddhist history during that period, Sanskrit is somewhere underneath that process. I thought it would be useful just to sort of see a comparison. What does Sanskrit look like versus other important early languages like Pali or Gandhari to show you it's not that different? So this passage means the path leading to the end of suffering. Maybe we could pronounce the Sanskrit one together. Do you know the word for suffering in Sanskrit? Dukkha. Dukkha, yeah. So that first word is dukkha. Repeat after me, dukkha. Nirodha. That means end. Gamini, going. Pratipad, path. So the path that goes to the end of suffering, dukkha nirodha gamini pratipad. It's pretty close to these other ones, right? Even if you don't read these languages, you can see it's not so different. Dukkha nirodha gamina padivada. That's a little different, right? Dialectal difference. So we're not talking about Chinese and Sanskrit, much closer. What language did the Buddha speak? What's that? Oh, Prakrit? Prakrit. I'll tell you my best answer before I do anything else. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, if I'm being honest. The Theravada tradition says it was Pali. Pali is their canonical language. It's the language for their services, the language in which Buddhism is taught. But Pali was probably not the old language of the Buddha's homeland. It was probably a kind of composite of a bunch of regional dialects that, like Sanskrit, got nicely fixed so it could transmit Buddhist texts clearly and consistently. Did the Buddha speak some indigenous language not related to Sanskrit? That's possible. Did he speak many languages? Probably. Lots of regional differences in dialect. Town to town, different languages might have been used. Some traditions say the Buddha forbid using Sanskrit in the early years, that there are two Brahmins who came to him and asked, can we teach in Vedic? That's how it's translated often. And the Buddha said, no, teach it in one's own, people translate it as one's own dialect. And so people have often thought the Buddha meant use local languages. But it's two words that have given rise to lots of hot air and scholarly confusion. Nobody knows. Nobody knows if the Buddha cared what language Buddhism was taught in. What we know for sure is that all the sutras show the same behavior. They show the Buddha teaching to people where they are, teaching what people could understand in that moment, person to person. What language it's in doesn't really ever seem to matter. So there's still so much mystery about the earliest languages. The question we might want to ask ourselves is, does it matter what the language was that he spoke or his early followers spoke? So how many of you know of this? Oh yeah, question.
Were there some local dialects possibly about your guy that eventually got swamped by Sanskrit?
That's a good question. I mean, the Vajrayana traditions like Tibet and Shingonshu and Tendai to a degree are developments. Those transmissions came around the 7th century out of India. And so they reflect what was dominant in North India around that time. It's really actually surprising how fast those traditions got transmitted, especially to China and Japan. But they reflect a certain language. So Siddham script, have any of you ever heard of this, or do you recognize this script? This is one thing Leonora suggested I might mention, but this is a script that like Shingonshu and Tendai Shu tend to use. And it reflects the script that was used in North India when those schools were transmitted out of India in the 7th-ish century. So Sanskrit was written in that script in India, and those manuscripts that made it to China and then Japan had that script on them, particularly where mantras were written. So like Namo Amida Butsa, this kind of chant, you might say, would have been in those manuscripts maintained in the original Indian language so they could keep it as close as possible to it. And if nobody's particularly interested in Siddham, I'll kind of skip from here. Just know that when you look at those schools' images, particularly using this sort of special script, Indian script, It's just the script from North India at the time those traditions moved out of India. So let me skip this. So what about modern global Buddhism? What's the importance of Sanskrit, and what languages are important in thinking about talking about Buddhism across regions today? I think we already mentioned, but for Theravada communities, Pali is so deeply influential. If you go to Thailand, many modern Thai words are actually derived from Pali, not Sanskrit. But it's also just the language that people use to talk about Buddhism. If you take a class on Buddhism, Pali technical terms will be used. But for Mahayana communities and Vajrayana communities, like in Tibet, in the US, across the world really, Sanskrit tends to be the shared language, the language that when we talk about key Buddhist technical terms, Dharma, Sangha, Buddha, Bodhisattva, we tend to use the Sanskrit words, even though the Buddha probably never used those Sanskrit words himself. And where I study at universities, it's really that way. Sanskrit, you learn Sanskrit first, and then you can study Buddhism. If you want to learn Pali or Gandhari or even Chinese, if you're doing Chinese Buddhism, you really learn Sanskrit first, and then you go learn the rest, because Sanskrit sort of gave birth to so much of what comes after this, or after it. So even though the Buddha and his early community probably had nothing to do with Sanskrit, and Pali is actually not probably his local dialect, these are the two Indian languages that have been used the most today for talking about Sanskrit. Okay, so a few takeaways. Learning Sanskrit connects you to the shared vocabulary developed in India for really 2,000 years, probably 2,000 years of Buddhist history, but for at least 1,000 years. And so even though the Buddha might not have spoken Sanskrit or even Pali, the Buddhist communities of South Asia used both of those languages from a very early time all the way to the time Buddhism died out in India. But Buddhism can be studied in any language. I would argue that Japanese and English are equally Buddhist languages. There's no reason that Buddhism can't be transmitted and communicated in any modern language with any less authority. But I think the complexity and richness of some of these difficult underlying concepts really emerges when we look at it in the original. So the last thing I wanted to do today was look at one little passage from the Heart Sutra. How many of you have ever read the Heart Sutra? A few of you. Okay, I know it's not as important in Jodo Shinshu, but it is a widely used text across many traditions, Mahayana and Vajrayana. And it gives us a little interesting view into how different translators struggle to communicate important Buddhist ideas in English, for instance. And so let's just look at, there are two slightly different versions of the Heart Sutra that I've got pulled up here. And it's just little snippets here. And it describes Kanon, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, who is a Mahasattva, a great being, and who is practicing the practice of the perfection of wisdom, which some of you may have heard that term before, and it's deep. And he looked out. Vyavalokayati. See this word? Vyavalokayati. Do you hear the lok? Avalokiteshvara. Vyavalokayati. The name kanon in this case is turned into a verb, to help describe why the person has that name. But look at how these different translators try to deal with the action that Avalokiteshvara is doing. This first one by Mueller says, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was performing his study in the deep prajna paramita, performing his study. This other translator, who has basically the same passage, says, was moving in the deep course of the wisdom which has gone beyond. If you'd never seen this before and you just read the English, would you even know it's the same text? the same exact Sanskrit underneath. Moving in the deep course. You may remember this, Leonora, this little Sanskrit root word. Remember we talked about bha, kri, dri, bud, all these little Sanskrit root words. This one is char. Char just means to move or practice, maybe. And so depending how you translate it, performing his study, moving, it seems like, what is Avalokiteshvara actually doing in the second translation? Just moving in the deep course. It's just being in this wisdom. But at the top, it seems as if Avalokiteshvara is sitting down with a book in hand and studying, right? Practicing something. So very different. The second thing I want to point out is the translation that comes next. Let's look at this one down here first. He beheld but 5 heaps. He beheld but 5 heaps. What's a heap? 5 piles of stuff. Do you know what heap might be trying to get at in terms of Buddhist concepts? The one above says, there are 5 skandhas. Anyone ever hear that word skandha? When the Buddha teaches about the person, Irene, do you remember what the skandha is? Or what any of the skandhas are? It's okay if yeah. Perception, the body, habits, all these things that we confuse for ourselves. We think it makes us a kind of individual person. So if you just read the one below down here, all you would think is he saw 5 piles of empty things. You'd have no idea. But when you read the translation by Mueller, you think, oh, it's this technical Buddhist category that has to do with the nature of a person's identity and self. And so translating these into English, oh, such a challenge. And when we look at the Chinese translation, we can see, I'm not really good at Chinese, but I can see down here, it's 5. This is the technical term that any Chinese reader at the time would have known means skandha. Heap is not a technical term, right? So anyway, we could do this for days and days and days, and you would see that, well, actually one of the coolest parts is often when we're translating ancient Buddhist texts today and we say, oh, this is a problem. I don't know what this, here's one version and there's some grammatical problem. Here's another one. There's also a problem. Here's another one. There's also a problem. Here's the first Chinese translation. They didn't seem to get it. Here's the second one. They had a problem. We and they are all going through the same thing, which is there's some really challenging part in the original history of this text, and everybody throughout history has struggled with it, which I think is just part of understanding Buddhist literature, struggling with that kind of thing. So it is challenging, but I think it's great fun. So I'll stop here and ask if there are questions about Sanskrit and Buddhism, about language, about Buddhist history in India. I'd love to chat with you now or even afterwards if some of you are like, get me out of here. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
If you have area and you're in modern terms, because friends here, what is the original push-up area?
That's a great question.
Your friend. There's an area.
Yeah, so these like Middle Indo-Aryan, New Indo-Aryan, this is a linguistic category. Actually, the early Vedic texts, those ones that were teaching how to do these early Hindu rituals, they call certain groups of people Aryas. And this word Arya is the same word that you find in the Noble Eightfold Path. If you've ever heard the Noble Eightfold Path, it is the Arya Ashtanga Marga, the Aryan. So the Buddha tried to sort of redefine. If the early text described Aryans as a certain class of people who perform these religious rituals limited to that class, not everybody could be considered Aryan. The Buddha said, no, anybody who does Buddhism is Aryan. You know, that's what real Aryan is. Sometime in the 18th and 19th century, European linguists started studying Sanskrit, and they decided that Sanskrit was somehow because they saw, oh, it's connected to Greek and Latin historically, so they decided it was somehow the parent language in the parent tradition of these intellectual European traditions, and so they wanted to consider themselves the true inheritors of the Sanskrit wisdom. And so this notion of the Aryan that they kept finding in those texts, they adopted. And of course, the ugliest end of that is what happened, in Germany. And so the notion of the modern use of the word has to do with that European appropriation, and unsurprising the way that colonial officers could mutate, such an idea to a nefarious end. Not Arabic, which comes from a different language family, but I think Farsi is. So Persian languages are, in fact, Iran, the old languages of Iran are the closest ones to Old Sanskrit. So the earliest Iranian religious texts, Zoroastrian literature, the language is very close to Vedic Sanskrit. And so anything derived from Vedic Sanskrit or Old Persian is close.
Yeah.
Sure. Hi, I remember you, yes.
Yes, I loved your class.
So,
And I'm wondering, as a, access student with my student ID, how accessible are the Gandhar scripts, manuscripts?
so to see the physical copies, so we have actually some of the oldest Buddhist writings ever found are now held at the University of Washington, were recently donated officially to the University of Washington. They're not letting us take them out right now. So I promise I will work on it. And we have done it in the past. If you want to come look at these old pieces of birch tree with what my wife calls squiggles on it, I'd be happy to talk through some of them with you. But it may be some time before they feel comfortable, because in the glass that they're kept in, it's not perfectly secure. So every time they move it and tilt it, pieces might shift a little, and then it's hard to read them. So, yeah. Other questions, Leonora?
A book for I focus study group now, and they're talking about Japanese Buddhism during the Meiji period. And it shows in the book that they had these siddham, or sort of Sanskrit versions of the text in Japan, but nobody could read it. So they didn't actually find out that much about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism in Japan until the Meiji period. Is that something that you've heard?
Yeah, it's interesting. The earliest stories of Kukai discovering esoteric Buddhist manuscripts in Japan, there's a story that he discovered one in the earth and then went to China to learn about it, express his own confusion about seeing the siddham parts. But in many cases, the Sanskrit mantras that would have been preserved in siddham script were also sounded out using Chinese characters. So you could pronounce it by the Chinese pronunciation of those characters at that time, and it wouldn't be the same as the Sanskrit, but it'd be quite close. And so I think people could still do the chants, but only a select few people could actually read the underlying siddham Indian script. I bet by the Meiji period, much of that had been lost. They would have had to learn it in Chang'an, in the capital of China, at the time where the best Sanskritists were, and then certainly some made it to Nara and Kyoto. And a lot of time passes. The same problem today. How many people can read these strange languages in scripts today? Sure, in the back.
Where's flag?
It's not ridiculous.
Yeah, I didn't did that one.
Reporting in the house. I could. I'm afraid. And wait.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So Buddhists did not use Sanskrit in the early years. 600 years. Didn't refuse to use it, but also maybe it was just so restricted to that early Hindu world that it wouldn't have been appropriate. No one else could use Sanskrit. Kings couldn't use Sanskrit. Nothing was written in Sanskrit except religious material and material that explained religious material for Hindus. But I think that spell seems to have been broken. The story goes that a foreign king came in and in the west of India had a poem written to praise him and all of his exploits and all the areas he conquered in perfect Sanskrit. And that would have never been allowed. And so people say around the 1st century, this must have been part of a tradition of just starting to break the spell, using it for political reasons and other reasons. And it seems that the prestige of Sanskrit grew fast. And as the prestige grew, also probably the understanding of its very nicely studied and taught grammar was accessible. And instead of having all these minor languages transmitting Buddhist texts and people getting them and saying, oh, why are these slightly different? I don't understand this, or I don't understand that, or their dialect isn't our dialect. What if we just used one dialect? And we all have access to good grammars or teachers, and we can faithfully transmit Buddhism in a nice fixed way across all of North India and then Central Asia. And it doesn't mean there still weren't many other languages being used, but Sanskrit just comes to be dominant. And that's probably why Buddhists adopted it over time.
Yeah. Well, the garden. And then it's something that it's going to cost somebody to translate, right? You either have a religion that's established that can have literate translators to do the work, and you can, so you have to have a king or an emperor or somebody that's like dissident. Yeah. But the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking to these was, if Sanskrit was the language of the religion, then wouldn't it have structures that start to talk about things that have a beyond peers daily understanding? That might be more expressive as language because it has that deep history to it.
Yeah. And in fact, Buddhism doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops in conversation with all these other religious schools, including Hinduism. All these different Hindu schools. Anyone ever heard of the Upanishads before? These philosophical texts of early Hinduism. A lot of the same concepts are being batted around with slight differences by different schools. So the Dharma is a contested category. Nirvana and moksha are contested. How do you get there? How do you meditate? You know, certain Hindu schools had a certain view of meditation, really close to the Buddha's view, but the Buddha had a slight difference. The Buddha taught it this way. It's not that they're the same, but that they had the same conversations and the same concerns. How do we escape suffering? How do we escape the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth? The gods are in both traditions, you know? And so maybe it also had that. It was ready-made. Here, we've already got a nice fixed language that's talking about most of the same stuff you're talking about, just in a different way. And if the Buddhists take that, it also sort of says, hey, look, all those Hindu priests, if we use their language and their concepts, kind of lends us some credibility socially. Yeah. Okay, maybe I've talked enough. Thank you very much for your patience. If you have other questions, I'm happy to chat afterwards. But thank you for having this. And thank you, Leonora.